Hello and welcome to ISAD. I'm Ngudu Olde. A damning report by the Human Rights Watch last week has exposed horrific torture and killings committed against prisoners in Jail Ogaden, a prison in the Somali region of eastern Ethiopia. Located in the capital, Jijjiga, Jail Ogaden holds prisoners accused of being members and supporters of the Ogaden National Liberation Front, ONLF, a front that until last week was labeled as a terrorist organization by the Ethiopian government. The report, which is based on about 100 interviews, including 70 former members of Jail Ogaden, documented torture, rape, long-term arbitrary detention, and horrific detention conditions in Jail Ogaden between 2011 and early 2018. FELIX HORNE is the senior Ethiopia and Eritrea researcher for Human Rights Watch. He will talk to me about the report and the related human rights issues in Ethiopia. Thank you very much, FELIX HORNE. Thank you for coming to the studio here to talk to me on the report.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
A very disturbing report. Yeah. So,
Indeed.
What are the techniques they use to torture these people?
I mean, there were a wide variety of techniques. I mean, the most obvious one, I guess, was just repeated beatings, for many, many hours on end. I think what separated Jail Ogaden perhaps from some of the other detention centers in Ethiopia where we've documented torture is that there were not only these individual beatings, the individual torture, security officers and one detainee, but they frequently took individuals in front of the entire prison population and would humiliate them. They would say things like, point out who in the crowd you raped when you were a member of ONLF. And if you don't point out anybody, then you'd be beaten in front of the entire prison population. You would be stripped naked. You'd be made to just ridicule other people in the crowd. So there's this constant sort of cycle of humiliation and torture. And then when these sort of group meetings ended, people would go back to their rooms, to their jail cells, and then individual interrogation would start at night from the cabas, which are the heads of the individual jail cells, where you'd be interrogated, questioned about why did you support ONLF, what did you do when you were a rebel, and again, if you don't answer correctly, you get slapped, you get kicked, your name gets passed on to the prison guards or to the Leo police, and then you're taken away for further one-on-one interrogation. So there was just a non-stop cycle of torture and abuse, just detainees just described no break from it. I mean, some of the techniques included tying heavy weights, water bottles to people's testicles, sometimes parading them in front of the entire prison population that way. We also had cases where individuals were stripped naked and packed tightly together into rooms. There were situations where individuals were stripped naked and made to walk around holding each other's genitalia. There was a lot of water-related torture, so putting people into water until they almost faint, then pulling them out, asking them questions about the ONLF. So a wide variety of different things.
You have talked to some of the former prisoners from Jail Ogaden. Were they really members of the ONLF? Because from experience, the Ethiopian government just label you whatever and put you in prison. So from your understanding, speaking to the former prisoners, I mean, were they really, is there any evidence that they were really members of the ONLF?
I mean, of the 70 prisoners that we interviewed, former prisoners that we interviewed, only 4 had ever been to court. So there's no sort of credible charge, there's no sort of due process to understand if they are in fact members or supporters of what was the banned organization, the ONLF. There's clearly ONLF fighters and members in the prison. And the people that we interviewed, they don't hide that fact. It's not like there's any shame in saying that they're a member of this group. But the vast majority of individuals seem to have little or no affiliation with them. So the strategy in the Somali region, as it has been for a decade or more, I mean, the Ethiopian army carried out this strategy, and then it was the Leo police, is to collectively punish the civilians in the areas of ONLF activity and the areas where the ONLF typically have support. So what we would see is the ONLF would carry out an attack on a military installation, and then the days after that, the army or the Leo police, depending on what it was, would go to these villages, would arrest a lot of people, sometimes would execute people, sometimes would rape people. And this is part of the strategy. And with the idea that an armed group that is operating in the bush, so to speak, I mean, what does it need? It needs water, food, shelter, access to intelligence, all of that sort of thing. So this is kind of their strategy to defeat the ONLF, as just to collectively punish everybody for providing that sort of support. And you know, in some ways it worked, right? The ONLF is not as powerful as it once was.
The Leo police you just mentioned, they were also included in the report that they were the ones, including the officials, of course, actually taking part in torturing these prisoners. But let's talk about that.
Yeah, very clearly. I mean, there's the aslupta, so the prison guards are the ones that ostensibly, you know, officially have the mandate to be managing the prison. But the Leo police, as they've become a bigger sort of force within the Somali region, have taken on more and more roles and responsibilities in the prison over many years. So the report, as you mentioned, covered a wide area from 2011 up until 2018. So the early years, it was more aslupta, the prison guards, and then the Leo police have taken over. So we name a number of individuals in the report. Many of them are members of the Leo police. Many of them have ranks within the Leo police. And I think one of the things that allowed us to corroborate a lot of the information that we heard from torture victims is that we also talked to members of the Leo police about their strategies, their tactics, and perhaps most importantly, their command structure. So you know, where does orders flow from the top down to the bottom, and that allowed us to name names like Abdi Ili, the president of the Somali region, who operationally is very much involved in many of the Leo police human rights abuses, not only throughout the region, but in jail Ogaden specifically.
You mentioned Abdi Ile. He just blamed in a video yesterday everything on the former spy chief, Getachew Asefa. But the Leo police, from what I understand, as you know, is answerable or reports to Abdi Ile.
Yes.
Let's talk about the roles of the officials like Abdi Ile in human rights abuses in the Somali region.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. I mean, Abdi Ili is involved in so much. I mean, he was the head of security while the Ethiopian army was committing what Human Rights Watch believed was war crimes and crimes against humanity in their counterinsurgency campaign in 2007, 2008, and then of course he was promoted to regional president in 2010. When the Leo police became more of a force. Now, the Leo police have a murky legal mandate at best. There's Leo police forces, of course, in various regions around Ethiopia. But in the Somali region, I mean, they're effectively a paramilitary group. I mean, they've replaced the Ethiopian army in their counterinsurgency campaign against the ONLF using the exact same tactics. Now, there's a formal command structure. Then it goes up to Abdurrahman Labagoli, who's the head of the Leo police. Then he officially reports to the president, to Abdi Ili. But in practice, what all of the Leo police individuals that we interviewed talked about was that there's this sort of parallel structure that goes direct to Abdi Ili. So if you're in a village and you've killed a number of quote-unquote rebels, you would contact Abdi Ili to kind of promote yourself, to talk about what you've done. And similarly, he would give you some direction on what to do next. So he's heavily involved in so many aspects of these human rights abuses. I think there's always been doubt about how much sort of command control he has over the Leo police, but I think it's quite evident from all the former security officials that we interviewed that he is quite involved. What that means is that he has a lot of blood on his hands. And when we think about, the reforms that are happening in the country, they're very hopeful, very optimistic. One of the things that we feel has been lacking in many of Dr. Abiy's speeches is talking about accountability. And so Abdi Ili has tried to find various ways the last few days to try to survive. I mean, there's lots of indications that he was asked to resign by the Prime Minister's office over the weekend. And initially it sounded like he would accept that. But of course, now he's gone back to Jijiga. He released a number of prisoners. He's announced that jail Ogaden will be turned into a mosque. And he's, yeah, as you say, he's completely changed his perspective and has turned his targets on Getachew Sefa and the TPLF. So this is a radical shift. But, you know, I think how Dr. Abiy handles the Abdi Ali situation is going to be almost a litmus test for how he handles accountability. Abdi Ali needs to be held accountable, and Ethiopian Somalis deserve justice for all the horrible atrocities that he's been responsible for.
When with all the mounting allegations and accusations against him, I think it's high time that the new administration, you know, will put a check on him and you know, investigate more. But this is not the first time that we had human rights abuses and extrajudicial killings in the Somali region of Ethiopia. In 2007, 2008, from your earlier reports, there were mass killings of suspected ONLF people by the Ethiopian military.
Yeah.
Let's give our audience some history about that report. I understand you had that report out during that time.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, there's a lengthy background between the relations between the ONLF and the state, of course, and Meles Zenawi, you know, effectively engineered the ONLF's removal from power, and then they became sort of an armed opposition group. And things sort of changed when they attacked the Chinese oil installation. A number of foreigners were killed, a number of Ethiopians were killed as well, and that's when the Ethiopian army decided it was time to deal with this problem of the ONLF. You know, partially because the oil is a huge potential revenue for the state, for the federal government. So the Ethiopian army engaged in extrajudicial killings, rape, burning of villages, you know, very, very serious crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity. There's been absolutely no accountability about that whatsoever.
There were disturbing video evidences from that killings.
There's a lot of evidence, yeah. I mean, it wasn't particularly hidden. You know, and when we talk to, you know, I interviewed Ethiopian Somalis about what's happening in Jail Ogaden, they still bring up those incidents. It didn't suddenly stop. It continued for several years, and then the Ethiopian army was replaced, and the Leo police came in and did exactly the same things. And they talk about that. There's no accountability. And there's all this hope now from Dr. Abiy, which of course is wonderful, and we do share that optimism. But what that means for Ethiopian Somalis is that they are telling me that they feel like that the issues that they have faced don't necessarily matter as much, because all the individuals responsible for all of those brutal atrocities are still running free today.
Yeah. The Ethiopian Human Rights Council, that's a government, a body set up by the government. They claim to have done some investigations. That was also pointed out in your report. But how independent is this body? Because I understand recently there has been a change in the leadership of that institution. But how independent is that, and how true and effective were their investigations in your report?
I mean, I think it's important to differentiate between the Human Rights Commission, which is clearly connected to the government, and the Human Rights Council, which is independent, yes, but struggles because of government repression. So the Human Rights Commission did visit Jail Ogaden a number of times, and that's, you know, to their credit. They visited and tried to investigate. And we know that not because the Human Rights Commission told us that. You know, they did not respond to our letters. We sent letters in April with a summary of findings and asking some basic questions. There's no evidence that reports, for example, were produced, so there's no transparency around what they found, what actions they recommended, and what actions were ultimately taken. But what we know from virtually every prisoner that we interviewed, they described what would happen when the Human Rights Commission would come. And what would happen is that those prisoners that had the most visible injuries from torture, those women that were very pregnant, were visibly pregnant, old men, those that were handicapped, were all taken out of the prison for several days. They were taken to a Garbasa military camp, which is nearby. They were taken to various places and just kind of hidden from view. There was also, you know, the members of the Somali regional government, some of the Leo police would come and speak to the prison population ahead of time as well, and say, here's what you say, here's what you don't say. Sometimes meat was brought in the days before the visit, so that you could, you know, the prisoners could say, oh yes, we have fresh meat all the time. There were times when individuals were handpicked to say things to the commission. There's one sort of case that a lot of people brought up where a person, the commission is typically from the federal government, so they're typically speaking Amharic, and most of the prisoners, of course, speak Somali. So there was one prisoner who was, quote unquote, educated, who spoke Amharic, and he was told what to say, and he told them something completely different. He was open and honest about what he saw, and he was beaten to death by prison guards and the Leo police in the days that followed. And this example was raised many times by Leo police when they were telling prisoners what to say in the future. So they would say, remember what happened to that person 2 years ago who spoke up against this. Don't be the next one. So, and the commission tried, it sounds like they tried different things. They tried to talk to people one-on-one. They tried to do group interviews. They asked questions about room number 8, which is the room of very small rooms, solitary confinement that everyone had a lot of fear about. So they did try, but the Somali regional state did what they could to prevent meaningful investigations. Now, one of the things that's problematic about all of that is that the prison visits were not unannounced. And what a number of people have told us from the Somali administration is that in other parts of the country, some of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission's prison visits are unannounced. So you show up, you interview, you get more accurate information. Whereas in the Somali region, they all had to go through the president's office before they were granted access. So obviously that gave him time to orchestrate this drama about what to tell them.
Yeah, but the commission, they never came out with a report anyway, right?
No.
They just hold everything.
Exactly, and we don't know if reports were produced, and they're just hard to find. I mean, it's not clear what happened.
There have been very interesting developments after the release of your report. I mean, I think it was the next day there were reports that the prisoners who were in jail Ogaden were transferred to various other small prisons in the region, which, to be honest, was not corroborated by third-party independent people. But that is what what is your information as far as the aftermath of the report is concerned?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear a number of prisoners were released after the report came out, and there are press statements on the sort of unofficial state media, I guess you would call it, from Abdieli that say, yes, the prison will be closed, it will be turned into a mosque, all prisoners have been released. I think what we've seen in the past when there's been pressure, sometimes from the Human Rights Commission, sometimes from other institutions, that he releases prisoners and then they very quickly get rearrested. Now, will this happen this time? Let's see. I mean, the landscape is very different. In April, for example, there was, when a lot of political prisoners were being released countrywide, there was pressure on Abdieli to be releasing prisoners. So he announced the release of about 1,500 prisoners. Now, it was clear that many prisoners were not released, but some clearly were, and we've interviewed some of those. But a lot of them were taken to Gode, to a labor camp.
Okay.
So they're building houses as we speak under the supervision of Somali region security. So that they've been released from jail Ogaden, but they're not free to live their lives. So I mean, Abdieli is a very tricky character, and you can't take what he says at face value. So far, yes, prisoners released, closure of jail Ogaden. This is very positive, but he needs to face justice.
Do we know how many prisoners were in jail Ogaden?
No, we don't. I mean, there's a lot of estimates that vary widely. I would say there's like thousands at any one particular time, 3, 4, 5, 6,000. But yeah, we got a wide variety of different estimates depending on the time. I mean, what was clear is that the jail is far too small for the amount of prisoners that were there. And overcrowding was a serious problem. And so many, I mean, virtually everybody that we talked to described this. They would come into the room and the Kaba, so the prisoner in charge of the room, would define a place for them to sleep. And it could be like that. They'd use the length of the forearm. People describe, if they wanted to turn, it'd have to be a big coordination so everyone could turn at the same time. They all described people being tortured at night, being returned to the room, and so just shaking, bleeding, and trying to find a place to sleep. Others described having to take turns sleeping. So you sleep for 2 hours, then you would stand for 2 hours so somebody else could sleep. And of course, as you can imagine, the hygiene conditions in the jail are absolutely atrocious. So when you're all packed together, malnourished, no health care, many people described a wide variety of ailments. Many people described people dying in detention from that combination of lack of sleep, lack of food, and torture.
Your report last week, it's 88 pages, I understand. And how, I understand it began with a video released, this video about prison guards admitting that they have been committing torture a while ago. I guess it's a video from 2011. It would be interesting how you gather your information, how you put it together, and how long did it take you to put this together?
It took a long time. I mean, it was about a year and a half of pretty full-on work. As you mentioned, it was 100 interviews, 70 with former detainees. I mean, it's very. I was surprised at how much fear there was of Ogadenis, Ethiopian Somalis, speaking out. You know, we've done many interviews over many years with many abuses in the Somali region, and typically Ethiopian Somalis are not terribly fearful. But something changed, something shifted in the time that we were doing this research. And so what we began, and we did the research in 10 different countries, so we were all kinds of different places where there are Ogadeni diaspora communities, and what we began to realize is that every single one of these communities, whether it's here in the United States, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in South Africa, the moment the diaspora go out to protest or they're active in social media, Abdi Ili targets their family members back home. And, you know, we put out a press release a couple of years ago about this in Australia, and there was lots of video of this where, you know, Abdi Ili and a government delegation were visiting Australia, and lots of people were protesting, and you had individuals on Abdi Ili's security team calling back home and arresting family members of those individuals that were protesting, and within 20 minutes, 25 minutes, they had been arrested. It was so incredibly quick. So what this means is that people were terrified to speak out. They were terrified that something would happen to their family members back home. So it was much more difficult to get people to speak than we anticipated. But, you know, yeah, eventually we managed to get up to 70 interviews, lots of women. Yeah, different times they were held in jail Ogaden. Some had radically different experiences, but there were definitely sort of themes. I mean, your average interview might last 2 hours. One interview was 8 hours. You know, so these are pretty in-depth. And nothing that's in the report is in there unless it was corroborated by at least 2 sources, and usually more than that. Now, the video was super important because the video is like this sort of smoking gun that you rarely get in Ethiopia, of prison guards admitting, not even admitting, almost bragging that they were torturing people. They were torturing people. They were raping people. They were robbing them of their belongings when they came into the jail, and they were directly pointing out who was responsible for that. Now, the government officials that were overseeing this assessment were Abdurrahman Lavagoli, who's now the head of the local police, Abdullahi Ethiopia, Ethiopia being his nickname, obviously, who was the vice president at the time and has been in jail Ogaden for quite some time, was released yesterday, and Abdi Bedi, who was the prison commissioner, the head of jail Ogaden for a while, who came up in so many interviews as being involved in torturing people, in raping girls. So yeah, it was a smoking gun. 25 hours of video we have. It's from 2011. It's a bit old, but combined with all of those interviews, we were able to. And it's also not just the victims, but I was surprised at how many former and current Somali region officials and security officials, including Leo police, were actually willing to speak to us. You know, they're afraid of speaking too loudly against Abdi Ili, but it's clear there's a lot of anger, a lot of frustration about what's happening, and so they're quite happy to provide us with information, different documents, things like that.
This Abdi Ili guy, I mean, the pressure is mounting on the new administration of Abiy Ahmed to, you know, do something about the region and stop all this craziness. And you put out a couple of recommendations, one which is for the establishment of a commission of experts. So what exactly do you want this commission of experts to do about the region, unless they have tools like backing from the new leadership of Abdi Ili? Let's talk about what the roles of the commissions that you'd like to play them.
Well, obviously, Ethiopia's regions have a lot of autonomy from the center, from the federal government. I mean, it's clear that Abdi Ili, the Somali regional government, was not controlled, but was influenced heavily by the center, and particularly by the military, and particularly by the Eastern Command in Harar. Anything like a federal commission of experts would be the federal government exerting their authority, reasserting their authority over what's happening in the region. One of the things that came up a lot is that regional prisons, not just in the Somali region, but across the country, are not really subject to much federal oversight. And that's a huge, huge problem. But at the end of the day, human rights groups, including Human Rights Watch, constantly call for independent investigations. The response from the Ethiopian government historically has been, we don't need international groups to do that. We don't need the United Nations to do that. We can do that ourselves. But as we've talked about, the Human Rights Commission isn't remotely independent. So something like a federal commission of experts is just one possible idea of something that would need to be empowered, sort of a new body that is empowered by Dr. Abiy to look into the abuses that are happening in jail Ogaden, to recommend criminal charges or other actions to be taken against not just Abdi Ili, not just the 6 other people we mentioned in the report, but anybody that is responsible for abuse. So that was one part of it. But the other part, which I think is important, is in the Somali region, there's no rule of law. I mean, there's just, we have concerns over lack of rule of law in various parts of the country.
I think it's pretty much everywhere in Ethiopia.
No,
the degree is different.
The degree is different, exactly. So the Somali region, it's just, there's nothing. As I said, 4 out of 70 people went to court. Those 4 people didn't know if they were charged. They had no lawyer. They weren't allowed to speak. We spoke to former judges who said they were put under pressure by very senior people to just write sentences. Here's a list of people, give them 10 years each. Others, when they refused to do that, were beaten up. The judges were beaten up. So there's just no rule of law whatsoever. When I ask people, have you been to court? They look at me like I'm crazy, and they just start laughing. So what needs to happen is those people need to be either charged with a crime, released, and obviously need a chance to go to court. But it's hard to do that when the judiciary is not remotely independent. And there's also very little capacity in the judiciary because Abdi Ili has made sure that all his people are there. It's about patronage. It's about people that are close to him, from clan dynamics, loyalty, different things, as opposed to who is qualified as a judge. So the idea was to pull together some judicial experts to try to get through that backlog of cases. Either charge people or release them. Now, there's just one idea for accountability, but there's obviously many.
Okay. So now we have a new administration in Addis Ababa, and have you seen any changes as far as handling human rights situations in Ethiopia over the past few months? Apparently, the killings have slowed down, I'm sure. But what is your assessment of the current situations?
I don't know, how long is your show? I mean, it's a huge question.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly there's been a lot of reforms that have been announced, and for years Ethiopia's human rights record, as you know very well, and your viewers know very well, was just on a downward trajectory. And there's been lots of positive things that Dr. Abiy has either done or has announced, and that's fantastic. We share the hope and optimism. At the same time, there are obviously individuals, groups within the ruling coalition who are against some of these reforms. So we'll see how they try to oppose, or if they try to oppose in the future, and how Dr. Abiy is able to navigate that. But I think there are a lot of worrying things that are happening, kind of simmering under the surface. And I mean, lack of accountability is one. I mean, if you look at everything Human Rights Watch wrote in the last few years, it's about security force abuse. And yet in all of Dr. Abiy's very hopeful and wonderful speeches, there hasn't been a lot of talk of security force abuse, of reforming the security forces, of holding individuals to account. Now, he has removed some very senior generals and senior members, and that's a good start in terms of reforming the security forces, but a lot of those individuals that were carrying out abuse are still in their positions. So accountability is super key. The other thing we really worry about is these little, they're not little, but these pockets of localized violence. There's a lot of ethnic conflict right now, more than I can remember. Over 1.5 million people are displaced right now from these conflicts across the country, and that's largely in 2 areas. The other conflicts, there aren't numbers available. That's globally significant in terms of IDPs, yet it's getting no attention. And it's getting no attention for a number of reasons, but one of them seems to me to be that there's such euphoria, understandably so, but such euphoria around Dr. Abiy and some of the reforms that he's announced, that there doesn't seem to be anybody that's raising concern or asking difficult questions seems to be kind of getting, shouted down a little bit. And I think that worries me sort of going forward. And clearly in these areas where there is a lot of displacement and we see a lack of security force presence there, federal security forces in the past were very abusive, very repressive, but they kept a lid on things. Now there's a bit of a void, a vacuum in some areas. There's many long-standing human rights abuses underpinning these conflicts that haven't been addressed. So as people are feeling more emboldened, more empowered, there's nobody sort of making sure they don't carry out acts of vengeance. We see a lot of score settling, and that's really concerning as things go forward. So lots of positive signs, lots of great reforms, but lots of things we should be watching pretty carefully too.
Very true. And holding the perpetrators into account is the central message you're trying to convey, I'm sure. Yeah. So where do you see Ethiopia in terms of its human rights handling? Are you optimistic about the future?
No, I'm very optimistic. Despite what I just said, there are lots of concerns, but yeah, I'm very optimistic. I mean, if you look at the political prisoners, all of the political prisoners, virtually all the political prisoners, the international groups like Human Rights Watch have advocated for, have been released. That's really, really, a radical shift. The CSO law, the anti-terrorism law, both of which really restrict the ability of people to express themselves. They haven't been amended yet, but there's lots of indications that they will be amended in a way that's rights respecting. This is very positive. But there are things like the Leo police reform, Abdi Ali being held to account, things that haven't yet happened, but will take time, right? You can't fix everything overnight. Yep. It will take time, so we're hopeful that he can continue upon that positive trajectory. But we have a long ways to go. We obviously have elections in 2020, which is going to be a massive test for the government. So yeah, we'll see what happens.
Well, with that good note, we will end this short interview. I know you have a very busy schedule, traveling back, but I appreciate you stopping by here to talk to me.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.